All right, so we're going to talk today about time travel because that was the majority desire. So I first of all, thank you very much for coming to the front. It makes me very happy. Let's give him a round of applause. Um, I don't know why there is this desire to hide as far back as possible. It's not as though anything bad is going to happen to you further up. Okay, so a little bit of admin before we get going. So the last thing you have to do for this class basically is a final exam. As you know. So just a few details about that. If I'm not mistaken, it will be on the 29th of April at 5 p.m. If I am mistaken, one of you should correct me now. It'll be pretty much the same. I don't know exactly where it is yet. I'll announce it on the website. It'll be some horrible and soulless place, no doubt. 40% of your final grade. It'll be the exact same deal as the midterm. So pretty much the same. Maybe a few more questions, but basically the same deal. 20 to 25 or so questions, and it'll be on the same kind of Scantron that you did with the midterm, so that should be all very familiar. So this time you can have 2 sheets of handwritten notes, and one of them can be your one for the midterm if you kept it. If not, you can make a new one. All of that is fine. Any questions administratively about the midterm before we get going? Or sorry, not the midterm, the final. You've already taken the midterm. Okay, so you might ask, how should you study for the midterm? Or sorry, for the final. I don't know why I keep saying the midterm. So here's my take on the best ways to study. So the first one would just be to talk to your friends and colleagues and family members about the course material. And I'm really serious about this. Go and tell some random stranger on the MRT about some of the arguments from the class. I think that this is by far the best way to test your understanding. If you're just oh, here's Lewis's argument against or for the possibility of time travel, and if you're able to explain it to somebody, especially without notes, that's a very good evidence that you've internalized it in a good way. Often you'll think that you understand something, and then when you try to explain it to somebody, you realize wait, I don't understand it all. So that I would say is the best thing. Also, you could review the lecture notes. All of those are on the website. You could review also the midterm, so you have the midterm and all of the answers from the midterm. The same people who wrote the final exam also wrote the midterm, so probably that gives a good insight into their psychology. Also, you could try to change the midterm questions by a little bit, and then try to answer the new versions. That's another thing you could do. And you could do this all in groups. Also, you don't have to do this individually. And I'm also going to post some of past year's exams to the course website, or I think actually in this case it has to be to Canvas because it's protected content or whatever. You can review these. It's not. I wouldn't necessarily say that this is the best way to study, just because the people who wrote those aren't necessarily me, and so it might actually. I will post these just to lessen your anxiety or something, but other people who taught this course might have used slightly different definitions of things. So I would use these with caution, just use these for a general idea about what an exam looks like. For real serious study, I would use the materials from this class because everything is asked according to the official definitions of views that we gave in this particular instance of this particular class. So be careful with that. That's just what that says. And also, you could. This is another thing you could try. I don't know how good it'll be, but you could try to feed the midterm to LLMs and then ask it to give you more questions like that. LLMs are getting pretty good at this, so I would encourage you to experiment with this. Of course, depending on how good the LLM is, you might get good or bad results. I don't 100% endorse what the LLM says, but it would be a good thing to play with, I think. So these are all different ways that you can study for the midterm. Also, I think making the handwritten sheet of notes is also a good way to study because it really forces you to condense the most important things that you learned in the class. Okay, any questions about how to study for the exam or anything like that? Okay. How are you all feeling about the exam? Are you all pretty raise your hand if you're pretty confident about your ability to do the exam. Raise your hand if you're freaking out totally. Raise your hand if you're somewhere in the middle. Okay, that's probably pretty good. So, yeah, feel free to ask questions about that. Okay, so today's topic is time travel. So there's lots of movies about time travel. It's a very, it's a topic that people think a lot about. And a topic also that like people often have desires about. Like I wish I could go back in time to like 2 days ago and short the stock market, for example. Like that would be an amazing thing. And so like one question is like, is my desire, like obviously it's not likely that I could do that. If I could build a time machine to go back in the past and short the stock market, I would definitely do it. But one thing you might ask is like, is my desire even the desire for something possible? Like, is this like a unlikely to be satisfied but possible desire, or is it a desire that makes literally no sense at all? And so that's the topic that we're talking about today. So this is one of my favorite time travel movies, Back to the Future. That's Doc Brown talking to his friend, and they're going in that car and they're about to travel back in time. So our question is like, does that really make sense to think that we could travel through time? And answering this question requires getting a firm grip on like what it would be to travel through time. So a lot of the Lewis paper that I had you read is dedicated to this question about like how should we even think about the definition of what time travel even is. Okay, so I had you read this paper by David Lewis. David Lewis is one of the most prominent philosophers of the last 100 years or so. He died in 2001. That's what he looks like. He wrote on like a lot of stuff and developed like really canonical and long-lasting, like long-enduring theories of lots of important philosophical concepts. So he did a lot of work in like applied game theory, especially kind of like cooperative games where you and somebody else are trying to cooperate to get some collective goal, especially like about social conventions and stuff. So he gives a theory of like how words get their meanings in terms of like cooperative games that we play. That was one thing he did. He also developed like the standard theory, or like one of the standard theories of counterfactual conditionals. So counterfactual conditionals are conditionals where they tell you what would have happened if something had been different. So for example, a conditional like if Singapore hadn't been kicked out of Malaysia, we would be able to go to JB without waiting in a huge line. So obviously like Singapore did get kicked out of Malaysia, and so we do have to wait in a huge line. But this is like telling you what things would have been like if things had been different. And so he developed a theory of these counterfactual conditionals. And the theory basically says like you imagine what it would be like to like change the world as little as possible so as to make Singapore not kicked out, and then ask whether in the closest world like that we were able to go to JB without a huge queue. And so he developed a lot of theories like that. One kind of notable thing about Lewis, and this is kind of an idiosyncrasy of his philosophical positions, is that he is a modal realist. So often philosophers of language and like philosophers of metaphysics and logic talk about possible worlds. So like even in my description of like what Lewis's theory of the counterfactual means, I sort of appealed to worlds. I was like, well, you imagine changing the world to like the nearest possible world in which the antecedent is true. So what am I talking about there? Well, Lewis thinks I'm actually literally speaking truly. So Lewis is famous for being a modal realist. That is, he thinks that our world is just one possible world among many, and every way that something could be corresponds to some world where things actually are that way. Prof. Millikan talked a little bit about this when we talked about the multiverse. This is like a version of a multiverse hypothesis. And so Lewis is like a very permissive multiversist. And so for Lewis, like existing in the actual world is the same kind of thing from the metaphysical perspective as like existing now somewhere in time. It's not as though the actual world is like metaphysically privileged. It's rather just like where you happen to live. You happen to live in this world, and that's what makes it actual for you, though there are other worlds in which that's actual for the people who live in those worlds. And from like the God's eye point of view, there's no real privilege. It's not like our world is like the real actual one. It's just like actual for us, just like other possible worlds are actual for other people. So these are like some of Lewis's most famous views. Anyway, but he has like a huge, wide-ranging philosophical work. Also, he did a lot of work on the prisoner's dilemma and Newcomb. So just to tie together to other things you've learned in this class, he was famous for being a two-boxer. So he believed that you should take both boxes, and he believed that if you do this, you should also defect in prisoner's dilemmas. So he basically thinks if you get arrested by the cops, you should rat out your friend if it has the structure of a prisoner's dilemma, or at least that's the rational thing to do. Okay, and he also spent a lot of time in Australia, so not so far from here. Okay, so what is the thesis of the paper? The thesis of the paper that I had you read is a very short paper and a very fun paper, I think. But he's basically just arguing for the claim that time travel is possible. Right? So he thinks that arguments that time travel is impossible are unsound. There's something wrong with all arguments that time travel is impossible. But of course, in order to understand what he's saying here, we need to understand two things, right? We need to understand what time travel is and also what possibility is. Because both of these things are actually not nearly as simple as you might originally think. So we're going to talk about both of these concepts in order to get a handle on like what Lewis is ultimately arguing. Okay, so like the first thing we have to realize is that there's not just one way for something to be possible, right? So possibility comes in lots of different flavors. So here's like a diagram of squaring the circle. So this is like an old problem in geometry, and the question was like, could you start out with a circle and use nothing but like a ruler and a protractor to get a square with exactly the same area as the circle that you started out with? And for a long time, it was like unknown whether you could do that. People had no idea. It turns out that it's actually not possible to do that. There's a proof that it's not possible, and it ultimately comes down to like the fact that pi is transcendental. But that's like not a possible thing to do. It turns out that it's like not really mathematically, or if you think that mathematics has to do with your concepts, not even really conceptually possible. And so, like at the broadest possible level, I think you could sort of think people who think that time travel is not possible are thinking that basically time travel is like squaring the circle, right? So it's like you might have thought that it was possible to do that, but if you think through really carefully, and that would involve doing a huge proof, you realize that it's not actually possible to do that. So it's possible that if we like think through the implications of time travel, we'll realize that we haven't really represented like a real possibility. We've like just said something that's like seemingly possible on its face, like squaring the circle with a ruler and a compass. Okay, so what kind of possibility are we talking about is the next question we have to ask. So like for example, let me just ask you some questions about like intuitive possibility. Like, is it possible to walk from Singapore to Malaysia without a passport or identification of any kind? I guess I want to know your thoughts on this. So like, who thinks this is possible? Who thinks this is not possible? Okay, so there's some division. For those of you who think it's possible, can you tell me something about like why you think it's possible? Yeah, good. So like, definitely it's like not legal to do this, right? Like, normally somebody's going to stop you and demand to see a passport, and if you don't have one, they're going to like turn you away or throw you in prison or something. But like, you think there's no like law of physics or something that says you can't do this. It's not like a natural law. If it's impossible, it's possible for some sort of legal reason. So definitely, I think we can say that walking from Singapore to Malaysia without a passport or identification of any kind is not legally possible, right? It's like not possible to do it consistently with violating no laws. Like you've definitely violated a law if you've done this. However, it is possible in lots of other ways, right? So physically it's probably possible. There's no law of physics that says you can't do this. I mean, it's kind of physically probably pretty hard because I think the border guards they pay a lot of attention. There's video cameras everywhere, but you can imagine they're all asleep or something and you just sort of like walk through and nobody notices. And definitely it's also logically possible, right? So it doesn't violate any law of logic that you walk from Singapore to Malaysia without a passport. And so already we see that there's a bunch of different kinds of possibility that we're talking about. There's like legal possibility, there's physical possibility, there's logical possibility. And so like when we're asking whether time travel is possible, we really have to be careful about what kind of possibility do we have in mind. Is it like legal possibility, logical possibility, physical possibility, etc. So like you might think that time travel has some sort of logical problem with it, right? So this is kind of like the first sort of sketch of an argument against the possibility of time travel. And so like, definitely it's the case that lots of time travel stories actually do have some inconsistency in them, and so are, like, representing something that is not really logically possible. So here is something that may be, like, logically or conceptually, in a broader sense, impossible. Here's, like, a story I'm going to tell. It involves time travel, and it doesn't make any sense, right? So here's the story. It's a very bad story. Tim goes back in time to a point before his parents were conceived. He finds his grandfather. He murders his grandfather. Right. Okay, so I've just told you a story. Does this story make any sense? Well, if you think through it, and you take on board, like, basic assumptions about genealogy and history, like that if you exist, you came from parents who themselves came from parents, then you immediately see that there's some sort of huge problem here, right? The problem is, in order to be born, in order to exist, you have to be born. In order to be born, you have to have parents. In order for them to be born, they have to have parents. And so if you murder the grandfather before you were born, you obviously can't have come into being. And so I've told you a story that's, like, not a consistent story, right? It's like, I guess it's a little bit controversial whether it's like a logical impossibility or more like a conceptual impossibility, but definitely at least it's like a conceptual impossibility, right? And so, like, in this case, it seems as though I've, like, given you a version of time travel stories that's not logically possible, and so you might think, okay, well, this shows that there's some logical problem with time travel, right? Because this kind of story is like a time travel story. But, so yeah, I think a lot of people have taken it that this shows that there's something, like, incoherent about the notion of time travel. But I think it doesn't really show this if you think through. Why not? Well, like, the fact that you can tell one story about something that's inconsistent doesn't show that there's a problem with the concepts you're using. So I'm going to tell you another story, and this story doesn't involve any time travel at all, but it's going to be equally inconsistent. So here's again the story. This is why I didn't go into, like, a career as, like, a literary author or something. But here's the story. Sally walks into the room. Inside the room, there's a refrigerator. Sally opens the refrigerator. Inside the refrigerator is a beer. Also, there's no beer in the room. Right? So that's also a story that doesn't make any sense. Right? I've told you that there's beer in the fridge is in the room, but then there's no beer in the room. But, like, if it seems like it's violating the transitivity of being inside or something like that, right? And so this story doesn't make any sense. But, like, I take it that none of you would think, oh, this story shows that there's some sort of logical problem with, like, the existence of beers or fridges or something like that. You'd be like, no, you just told a bad story. Like, you weren't a careful author. And so, the story is, like, inconceivable in a way, but it doesn't show that fridges or beers or rooms are impossible. And so, like, the really interesting question is, say that I tell a time travel story, and it seems to be, like, logically consistent, right? So according to Reddit, there are some movies like this. So Primer is one movie that some people think is logically consistent, a time travel movie. This movie called Triangle, and this other movie called Time Crimes. At least according to some people on Reddit, these are all, like, logically consistent time travel stories. Like, there's not, like, a logical problem with them. I think, unfortunately, I think Back to the Future is not a logically possible time travel story. It, like, makes not really a lot of sense. But there could be stories that are logically consistent that are time travel stories, right? So those all have really complicated plots, and, like, if you go to the Wikipedia page on any of those movies, you get, like, diagrams that are, like, huge, many pages long to explain the plot. So I'm going to give you a much simpler, logically consistent time travel story. So here's the time travel story. Sally's in her lab trying to figure out how to make a time travel machine. Suddenly, somebody who looks a lot like her but 10 years older appears before her and gives her the schematics for a working time travel machine, and then disappears. 10 years later, Sally finally got the time travel machine working based on those plans. She uses it to go back in time 10 years, and with the schematics in hand, give herself the schema, right? So this is a time travel story where it's not like killing your grandfather. It's more like a consistent loop, right? It's like she gave herself the designs to the time travel machine that enabled her to invent the time travel machine that she then went back in time to give her. And you might think that that's weird, but there's no, like, inconsistency there, right? There's, like, an answer to the question, how did she think of this time travel machine? Well, she got the schema. And then it's like, who developed the schema? Well, she did. And like, why did she develop the schema? Well, she invented the time travel machine. Why did she invent the time travel machine? Well, she had the schema, right? It's a loop. It's an explanatory loop. But from that loop, I haven't told you anything that contradicts itself, right? It's like a consistent loop. And so, like, the real question for us is, does a story like this involve some other kind of impossibility, some like other deeper reason why, even if on its surface it's logically consistent, you can't like prove a contradiction from it, it still ends up being impossible, right? So yeah, story seems logically consistent. So time travel, I think, from this we can conclude is logically possible. There's no logical inconceivability in time travel. And so when we're asking, like, is time travel possible, the question is really about some other kind of possibility, some kind of like stronger, more robust kind of possibility. Okay, the next idea might be that what we're really asking is whether time travel is like physically possible. So this is another kind of possibility. So this is just to like fix some terminology. We're going to call something physically possible if it's consistent with the correct laws of physics. Right? So the idea is like physics gives us a bunch of laws, like the ones I understand are all wrong, like F equals ma or something, but there's like relativistic and quantum ones that I don't understand. But they tell you a bunch of laws about like the way that things can evolve. Maybe one of the laws is like you can't travel faster than the speed of light. And like anything that travels faster than the speed of light is not really physically possible, even though it violates, or because it violates the laws of physics. And then just to like fix the concepts of possibility, and I think I said this already before, we're going to call something legally possible and implicitly relative to Singapore if it doesn't violate any law of Singapore. Right? So that's just what it is to be legally possible. Okay. So just for some examples, it might be like useful, especially when you're studying for the exam, to think about more examples, like what sorts of things are legally and physically possible. But here's an example, like traveling down the West Coast Highway at 150 kilometers an hour. That's totally physically possible, right? Like my motorcycle can do that, no problem. But it's not legally possible, because if I do that, the traffic police are not going to be happy with me. Although I don't think that there's really any place that they can set up a good sniper on that road, and so it's unclear that they'll actually catch me. However, traveling down the West Coast Highway at 2 times the speed of light, that is neither legally possible nor physically possible, right? Like that one, you can't even do it. Like the laws of physics tell you you can't do it. It's not just like the government of Singapore is telling you can't do it. And so like things are possible and impossible in different ways relative to different conceptions of possibility is the point. Okay, so now let's provisionally say that what we're asking is like, is time travel physically possible, right? So like, does it violate the laws of physics? Well, I mean, this is not a physics course. This might be like a very complicated question. I don't really know the up-to-date physics on whether the physicists think that time travel is possible. Maybe there's some weird things with like wormholes or something where you could have some weird temporal loops. But in any case, that kind of you would need to answer that in a physics department. It's not really a philosophy question. But I think this is not the end of the story. I don't think that this is quite what Lewis has in mind. So, like, here's a thought, that there's something in between physical possibility and logical possibility that is nonetheless very interesting. So, like, one thing that seems to make sense is that the laws of physics could have been a little bit different, right? I mean, Prof. Millikan was talking about this last week when he was talking about the fine-tuning argument, remember? Like, he was like, well, there's all these cosmological constants and stuff. Those look kind of arbitrary. They could have been otherwise, like the gravitational constant, for example. And if you think that they could have been otherwise, then there's a sense in which you're thinking, like, the laws of physics are not the broadest kind of possibility, because like the laws of physics could have been different. The gravitational constant could have been different. And maybe even more fundamental laws of physics could have been different in other possible worlds. So like here's some thought experiments that seem to justify this. Like you go back and watch Star Wars. In Star Wars, people travel faster than the speed of light all the time, right? They go into warp drive or warp speed or whatever. And it looks like that. And using that, they can like zap between stars much faster than the speed of light. So this is like not consistent, it seems, with our current understanding of the laws of physics. And so Star Wars is not a physically possible story. But nonetheless, I think we still feel like Star Wars isn't the same kind of inconsistency as like the dumb stories I told at the beginning of lecture. It does seem as though like the world really could have been like that. It could have really turned out that the laws of physics were like the Star Wars laws of physics, where there's like fundamental things involving like the force and the good side and the dark side or whatever. Definitely it's not logically inconsistent, but in addition to not being logically inconsistent, it looks like it's like a genuine possibility. It's like a genuine way the world could have been. And if you think that, then you think that physical possibility is not the most like fundamental, real kind of possibility. Things can really be possible that are not physically possible, like traveling faster than the speed of light, and maybe like time travel. So I'm not going to be able to give as clean a definition of this as the other kinds of possibility, but for the purposes here, we're going to call something metaphysically possible if it's consistent with the natures of things, construed in the broadest possible sense. What is the nature of things? That's like the theory that you would get in like something called metaphysics, which is like the study of the way that things are in the broadest and most fundamental possible sense. But I think the idea here is like, yeah, there's whatever this is, it's at least going to be a little bit broader than physical possibility. I say broader because I think most metaphysicians think anything that is physically possible is also metaphysically possible, but not the reverse, because like traveling faster than the speed of light is metaphysically possible, but not physically possible. And so like metaphysical possibility is like broader than physical possibility, but not so broad that it's like as weak as mere logical possibility. Okay, so I think that the question that Lewis is asking in this paper is really this question. It's like, is time travel metaphysically possible? That is my time travel story consistent with the nature of things construed in the broadest possible sense? Or is there some problem with thinking that time travel is like metaphysically possible? Okay, questions about the flavors of possibility before we go on. We're all clear on the definitions of the various different kinds of possibility? There's like a bunch of other kinds of possibility too. I'm just telling you about like the main ones that are relevant here. Okay, so another kind of housekeeping thing is that we're going to also sometimes be talking about necessity. Necessity is known as the dual of possibility. That is to say, the way that we're going to talk about any of these flavor of possibilities, like P, a proposition P is X necessary. So X like could stand for metaphysical or physical or legal or whatever. If and only if not P is not X possible, right? So like something is physically necessary just in case not it is not possible. And so I think there are some examples, like it's legally necessary to stop at red lights, just in case it's not legally possible not to stop at red lights, right? Like if you don't stop at a red light, you're violating a law. So it's not legally possible to not stop at red lights, so it is legally necessary to stop at red lights. This is just like the way that we're thinking about the relationship between possibility and necessity. And if you took like a modal logic course, you would really get into the weeds about like what exactly the principles are governing the relationship between these things. Okay, so far I told you like Lewis's thesis was that time travel is possible. So far we've been talking about the possibility angle, and I've argued that he's really like he's got metaphysical possibility in mind. But now we have to kind of think about what is the definition of time travel, because this is also not trivial. Okay. So the first thing that Lewis notes in the paper is that we're always sort of traveling through time, right? We're traveling through time at a rate of like 1 second per second, right? Like a second ago, it was a second ago, and now it's now. And so time travel is, in that sense, is definitely possible because we do it all the time. All of you are hurtling towards the future at exactly the same rate. Or if like relativity theory is true, at like slightly different rates depending on how much you're accelerating. But obviously, this is not what we mean when we ask whether time travel is possible. So, what do we mean? Like, how would you like define time travel? Actually, before we go on in the slides, I'm curious if you guys have like takes on this. Like, what is the intuitive definition of like real time travel? Or like, do you guys have in mind like some kind of definition? Like, what is time travel? Yeah, is there a hand back there? Mm. Sorry, at least a what? Uh-huh. So, but I can definitely travel a minute through time just by like waiting a minute, right? Yeah, and so what do you mean by immediately exactly? Yeah. Yeah, so it's like, I guess what I'm wondering is if time is just given by time, then like every time you time travel through a minute, you time traveled through a minute. And so I guess like there was this idea that you said at the beginning, which is that you do it sort of like instantaneously, right? Yeah. So the question is, what do we mean by that? Do you have an add-on to that? Being able to travel to any point in time at will. Yeah. So the idea is like I could will it to be a different time, like and all of a sudden have it be, I don't know, 400 BC. Yeah. Is it just that, or is it that you also have to be able to like bring yourself into existence then? Because like 400 BC did exist, and you weren't there, I assume. And so, like, is it time travel if you can will it that, like, say that you think, I mean, we'll talk a little bit about the different theories of time. Of course, that'll be a little bit relevant. But, like, say that you could just snap your fingers and God or something just, like, resets the clock of the world back to 400. And then it, like, evolves exactly as it did. Like, that doesn't seem to be a way in which you've traveled through time, really, right? Like, that's just made the world change what time it is. It's like the record skips or something. But in that case, your experience, like, think about what your experience would be. You would just, like, not notice that at all. Like, it would be like okay, I will it to be 400 BC, then God resets the world back to 400 BC, then everything evolves exactly as it did up until that time. And, like, there's no sense in which you've traveled through time. Yeah, do you have an add-on?
Yeah, so the same way that you can travel through space,
Mm-hmm.
the idea is that you can be able to travel through time. You live in a four-dimensional reality.
Mm-hmm.
I'm able to move forwards and backwards in space, like up and down. It's only that I'm not able to move through time. That always, at best, if I have to travel at the speed of light, which is impossible physically, but let's just
Mm-hmm.
I would be in that time station.
Yeah, so I think part of the idea is like you have to be able to like will yourself to take non-standard paths, so to speak, through time. Might be the idea, and I think that was also partly implicit in your idea, which is like it's like instantaneously all of a sudden it's a minute later. Like that could be like time travel. Of course, I think it like that would sort of make it like just that sort of makes it seem as though like getting really drunk and passing out is a way of time traveling because you like pass out on the street and all of a sudden wake up and it's like way later and you had no experiences in the meantime. But I feel like that's not like you don't time travel every time you get drunk. So yeah, I think actually it's like it turns out this is one of those things where like once you really start to think about what time travel would be, it becomes a little bit hard to even say what the definition is. I mean, I think we can take as our guide like these time travel movies and pieces of literature and try to like use those to get a handle on what the intuitive notion is. So this is something that Lewis has thought a lot about. So there's sort of like a skeptical angle on this, like a sort of like philosophical skepticism that the notion even makes sense once you even think about defining it. And so this is D.C. Williams, who's a philosopher at UCLA and Harvard, dead now, unfortunately. But so he says, time travel is analyzable either as the banality that at each different moment we occupy a different moment from the one we occupied before, or as the contradiction that at each different moment we occupy a different moment from the one we're occupying then. 5 minutes from now, for example, I may be 100 years from now. So D.C. Williams is basically saying, like, look, we all obviously travel through time in the normal way, 1 second per second, but if you try to like say, oh, it's like travel through time in a non-standard way, he thinks that there's like a logical contradiction in that. Because it would be like saying, like if we go by the example from over here, it would be like saying, it's like instantaneously, it's all of a sudden 5 minutes from now. But that just sort of means like 1 minute from now, it is 5 minutes from now. But that seems to be just like a logical contradiction, right? Like 1 is not 5, so 1 minute from now is not 5 minutes from now. So like Lewis is somebody who's very acutely aware of this kind of like skeptical definitional thing and tries nonetheless to give a workable definition of time travel that corresponds to our kind of like pre-theoretic idea of what it is given from movies. Or like from the beginning of lecture when I was like, oh man, I really wish I could go back in time and like short the stock market 2 days ago. All right, so the way that Lewis is thinking of it does sort of depend on a particular theory of time. And it's a theory that you were just talking about. So four-dimensionalism about time is the metaphysical view of time according to which time is just another dimension of this big thing called space-time. And so like if you look at what the world is, fundamentally speaking, it's not a three-dimensional thing that changes, but rather it's like a big, static, four-dimensional thing, and then beings like us are just like paths through this four-dimensional thing. So we're like three-dimensional objects that also evolve in this other dimension of time. So this is how Lewis is thinking about what time is. So I think this is just a direct quote from Lewis. He says, the world, the time traveler's world, or ours, right, so either kind of world, is a four-dimensional manifold of events. Time is one dimension of the four, like the spatial dimensions, except that the prevailing laws of nature discriminate between time and the others, or perhaps between the various time-like dimensions and various space-like dimensions. That is, he's saying there's no real like metaphysical difference between time and space. It's all just dimensions. But the laws of physics treat time like a little bit differently, especially when it comes to like thermodynamics and like entropy and stuff. But then you think, okay, so what really do I look like as a seemingly three-dimensional object? Well, he's like enduring things, and this is also a direct quote, are time-like streaks, wholes composed of temporal parts or stages located at various times and places. Okay, so this is a bit of a mouthful, but essentially what he's saying is that, like, what am I? Well, it seems as though I'm like a person with limbs and stuff, but Lewis is thinking like, from the perspective of the universe, what I really look like is an evolution of a three-dimensional body through the fourth dimension of time. And so sometimes four-dimensionalists talk about like space-time worms. The worm is like the path that my body makes through the other three dimensions. And so if you sort of like think of it if you think of the analogy, it's sort of like if there was, I think none of these pens are going to work. If you think, so none of these pens are going to work, so we can't draw diagrams, but it's like if you think about like a square moving through a third dimension, that's going to make like a kind of square, like a kind of square-like wormish thing. And so that's essentially what Lewis thinks we're like in time. And so when I speak about like temporal parts, all of my body now is one temporal part of me. The whole of me is the whole of my like space-time worm over all space. And properties that I have are properties of like my space-time worm relative to a time. So like if I, for example, gain a bit of weight, that's just saying like this part of my space-time worm was like 60 kilograms and then this part is like 65 kilograms. That's exactly like saying like this hand weighs something and maybe this hand weighs something else. Not normal, but possible. And so that's kind of like the big metaphysical picture that Lewis is working with. So if you took a metaphysics class, you would really talk a lot about this and like the difference between this kind of view and like three-dimensionalist views of space-time. Any questions of this before we go on? Just the kind of broad metaphysical temporal picture. Does it make sense thinking about yourself as like a big space-time worm? Okay, good. So given that, Lewis thinks that you can distinguish between this thing called personal time versus external time. So basically what he says is, I'm going to distinguish between time itself, or external time, from the personal time of a particular time traveler. Right? And so the functional role of these things is like real time is the fourth dimension. Right? That's just like there's a fact of the matter about what the three-dimensional world is like at a time. That's just like a snapshot of a three-dimensional object. But personal time is tied to my experiences. Roughly speaking, you can think of it as like what your wristwatch would measure. And already we had this idea floating around in the definitions of time travel given before, namely like this idea that like in a minute it can be 5 minutes from now. Well, that's like your personal wristwatch only reads 1 minute, but the external clocks read 5 minutes. That would be like a kind of time travel. That would like, and that is a kind of time travel that's not susceptible to this counter argument from being drunk and passing out, right? Because if you're drunk and pass out, your wristwatch is still ticking along normally. That's not like regular time. That's not personal time travel. And so now he's thinking, now at least we can say things that are time travel like without contradicting ourselves, without falling into this like D.C. Williams trap. So we could say without contradiction, he writes, that as the time travel prepares to set out, soon he shall be in the past. Right? So prima facie, before we distinguish between personal time and external time, this didn't really make any sense, right? Like soon it will be in the past. That's just like in the future it will be in the past. That's like a contradiction. But when we say this, what we're saying really is soon relative to his personal time, he will be in the past in the external sense, right, according to the clocks. We mean that a stage of him is slightly later in his personal time, but much earlier in his external time than the stage of him that is present as we say the sentence. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that, like, he personally is about to go forward and end up what we would think, like what the external observer would think of as the past. And so the analogy here is to highways. He gives the analogy to highways. So he's thinking that, like, you could think about external time as the actual, like, XY coordinates of the world, right? And so, like, whether 2 points are east or west or north or south, that depends on, like, the relation between the 2 points. But you can think about personal time, intervals of personal time, you can think about as distances along a winding path, right? So like this mountain road, which I think is in Norway or something, it winds through the mountain to go up the hill without going too steep. So he's like, the time traveler's life is like a mountain railway. The place 2 miles due east of here may also be 9 miles down the line in the westward direction. We don't really have these winding roads in Singapore, unfortunately, but like you can see that based on this picture. Like if you're, like, say that north is like that way and south is like that way, if you're on this, do I have like a little pointer? If you're here and you want to go north, the way to do that is to go south along your road. Right? This makes sense, I take it. And so this is the analogy you should think about when distinguishing between personal time and external time. Any questions about the highway metaphor? Like, so it makes sense that you could say, truly, like 2 miles due east of here is 9 miles in the westward direction. Like that makes sense, right? And and so now there's a question about, like, what makes it the case that this three-dimensional object that we observe, the world, this four-dimensional object, what makes it the case that the person who emerges in the past is the same person that disappeared from the future? And this is actually kind of a big problem for Lewis. So he says, like, what reason do I have to regard this person as one person and not two people? Right? And so here's basically the issue. It's like the external facts are, say that you time travel intuitively back to like 400 BC. You want to like talk to Socrates or something. So you like get into your time machine now in the year 2025. You end up back in the year 400 BC. That's the way of describing it where it's like time travel of you, or where your personal time goes from future to past, to like objective past. But here's another way that I can describe the same exact events randomly back in 400 BC, somebody with all of your memories pops into existence. Then they get back in their time travel machine, they die. Then you're born in the year 2000 whatever, and then you step in the time travel machine, and then you disappear for a bit, and then you reappear back in 2025 with memories as of being back in 400, right? Those are two different, like I've given two different descriptions of the same, like from the outside, those two possibilities are not really distinguishable. Like the same people appeared in this, like the same, I guess it's metaphysically loaded to say the same people, but like this, the same likenesses of people appeared in exactly the same places, talked to all of the same people, had all the same memories, etc. But in one, there's no personal time travel, and in another, there's personal time travel. And so Lewis is really interested in this question, like, what makes it the case that there's like real time travel of a single person as opposed to just random people popping up in space-time with weird memories and then disappearing? Okay, so his answer to this is that it's kind of, it's a little bit vague, but he sort of thinks that this is like a normal thing when we talk about like what unites people. And we'll actually talk about this a lot more next week when we talk about personal identity. Essentially, we're asking the question like, what makes a person like identical over time, especially with the possibility of time travel. So Lewis's answer is that what unites the stages of a time traveler is the same sort of mental or mostly mental continuity and connectedness that unites anybody else. The only difference is that whereas a common person is connected and continuous with respect to external time, the time traveler is connected and continuous only with respect to his own personal time. Okay, so again, we'll understand this a little bit more next week when we talk about personal identity. But basically, he's thinking like, what normally makes it the case that like I am the same person that introduced Peter's lecture the last time we met? Well, it's like I have enough of the memories, and also my memories evolved in the same kind of way, and also maybe I have like the atoms that constitute the person standing here kind of like moved along from the person that was standing here 2 weeks ago. Though, I mean, Lewis concentrates more on the psychological thing rather than the physical thing. But basically he's thinking like, if you have enough of the memories and a connected psychology and all of the same dispositions, those are normally the marks by which we decide, yeah, this is the same person as was there before. And so he's thinking, there's not really any difference between that, whether it's like temporally connected or temporally disconnected. If you have one person with like memories that are like following in a very natural way from that person, then he thinks that's just what it is to be a continuation of that person. And so the fact that we like chop off this segment of somebody and put it in the external past doesn't make a difference to personal identity. Obviously, there's more possibilities that like things go weirdly, and in that case, it might mess up the personal identity relations. But you can imagine in the good case that it works. And that's really all you need to prove that time travel is possible, right? Remember, when we're asking whether time travel is possible, we're not asking whether it's like likely or whether it's easy. We're just asking whether it's possible. And so like one coherent possibility of time travel is enough to prove that it's possible. Okay. So like the way that you should think about this, I think there's this like line, the downtown line in Singapore, and it kind of like intersects with itself weirdly, although I've never understood why they don't put a station there where it intersects with itself, because then you could like transfer to it from itself to itself, and that would be cool. But like it's the exact sort of thing. So like say that I tell you somebody is located exactly at the point where those two lines intersect on the downtown line. Is there a fact of the matter about what the next station is? It's like no, right? You need to know like what part of the personal line you're on. You could be on the way from I don't know how to pronounce these, but like from the 13th station to the 14th station, and in that case the next station is 14, or you could be on the other one. But you're like co-located in time. This is like this is the picture that you should think about when you imagine time travelers meeting themselves at like a time, right? So like if you go back and see yourself, that's what it's like. It's like your personal time has like looped back, and you're occupying like two slightly different spatial positions in the same time. Just like, the downtown line is not like the two lines sort of probably go over or under each other like that, so it's a little bit disconnected in space. It's like that. Okay. So, another weird fact about time travel is if it is possible, then reverse causation is going to be possible. So, causation is like one thing causing another. And normally we think that causation goes forward in time, right? So normally we think if somebody punches me and I get a bruise, it was like the punch in the past that caused my bruise now. If I try to take someone to court that they caused the bruise on my face by punching me tomorrow, the police aren't going to be very impressed and probably won't press charges. But if time travel is possible, then there's really no in-principle barrier to this, right? Because somebody could sock me tomorrow, and then I could go back in time, and I would have a black eye today. And what would be the cause of that black eye? Well, it would be the punch from the guy tomorrow, right? In the external sense. Of course, it's in the past in my personal time, but you get causality going backwards sometimes relative to external time. You might think that this is kind of a problem with time travel, but Lewis ultimately thinks that it's not really a problem. So, this is kind of one of the first arguments that Lewis considers against the possibility of time travel. And this is the argument from causal loops. So, yeah, I think we'll go back to our Sally story. So remember the Sally story, she gave herself the plans to the time travel machine. And there's an argument that you might make against time travel based on these causal loops. So here's how the argument goes. One, if time travel is possible, then causal loops are possible. Right. That is to say, the Sally story is possible. Also, the black eye thing is possible. These are cases where something causes something, causes something, causes something, causes itself. So, you can imagine the black eye story being a causal loop by imagining, the reason why the guy punched me is that I took him to court for punching me. Right? If time travel is possible, that is consistent. And it's weird, right? But it's definitely the case that if time travel is possible, then causal loops are possible, right? Another thing you might think is that there must be an explanation for any chain of causations, right? The whole point of causation is that causes explain things. If I say, why do I have this black eye? I'm oh, this guy punched me. It's like an explanatory relation. And so, yeah, the second premise is that there must be explanations for any chains of causation. Wait, what is happening? Why is this happening? Okay, good. Okay, and now, another claim is that causal loops have no explanation, right? What does this mean? Well, think back to the Sally story. I think you were all a little bit puzzled when I told you that story, and I think it's because it's every element in the chain has an explanation, right? You can explain why Sally has the plans. She got them from old Sally. And you can explain, how old Sally makes the machine. She has the plans. And then you can explain, why young Sally gets the plans. It's old Sally gives them to her. And so all of that is a tight causal circle, and every event in that chain has some sort of explanation. But you might think the whole thing has no explanation, right? There's something very unexplained, which is how did the time travel machine plans get into the world in the first place? It seems that is not really explained. It's explained by this loop, but the loop itself has no explanation. And so that's what Lewis is thinking by this third premise. Causal loops do not have explanations. And if 1 through 3 yields that time travel is not possible. Essentially, the form of the argument is if time travel is possible, causal loops are possible, everything has to have explanations, but causal loops don't have explanations, so time travel can't be possible. It's the high-level form of the argument. Okay. So, before we go on, which premise do you suspect that Lewis is going to take issue with? Sorry, do you have an answer? Yeah, and can you fast forward to why he's taking an issue with 2? Yeah, good. So I think he's going to take issue with 2, and I think he's going to sort of think, well, let's go down and see what he says. So this is what he says about time travel, or about these causal loops. So he's like, yeah, these loops are strange. But he thinks that these loops are not impossible, and not too different from inexplicabilities that we are already inured to. So that is, he's going to say, these causal loops are weird, but they're no weirder than things we already accept. So what do we already accept? Almost everybody agrees that God, or the Big Bang, or the entire infinite past of the universe, or the decay of some tritium atom is uncaused and inexplicable. Then, if these are possible, why not also the inexplicable causal loops that arise in time travel? So if we go back to the argument, essentially he's saying, like, you can, like, we ourselves do not think that every single thing has an explanation. Like, maybe you think that everything in the, like, most events in the real world have some explanation that traces back to the Big Bang, but then the Big Bang itself does not have an explanation, because if it did, then there would be, like, a prior event that explains it, but the Big Bang was, like, the first event, right? And so, like, if the Big Bang has an explanation, then it's explained by some prior event, in which case there's some prior explanation, right? And so, like, if you think about, you can think about this, like, graph theoretically, like, you're sort of, like, forced into this position where, like, there's always going to be some weird thing. Think about, like, the explanatory structure of the world, right? Either it goes on forever and never repeats, right? So that would be like an infinitary thing, like everything in the universe has some cause that precedes it that's different, and it never loops. That's one possibility. Or it sort of like, it ends up in these causal loops where it's like there's a circular form of causation, or there's like a first event that is uncaused that explains everything else. And I think what Lewis is thinking is, like, in any of these scenarios, and they're really the only possibilities for the structure of causation, in any of them, you're going to get, at the big picture level, like something that's not fully explained. If it's the infinite thing, right, so if it's the infinite thing, then it's like the whole infinite series doesn't seem to have an explanation. Each element in the series has an explanation, but like why that infinite series as opposed to some other infinite series? That has no explanation if you're an infinitist. If you think that there's like a first event, like the Big Bang, then the Big Bang has no explanation. Like that, like why was the initial condition of the universe this thing that would result in a Big Bang as opposed to some sort of other thing, like a small bang or something? That has no explanation in that case. Or you have it looping back on itself, exactly like in the Sally case. And in all of those cases, Lewis thinks, there's some aspect of the universe that defies explanation, that's just inexplicable. And therefore, if you think that, you're going to think that 2 cannot be right, right? It cannot be that there must be an explanation for any chain of causations because, like, we don't think that there's an explanation for, say, the Big Bang or the infinite series of events. And so for causal loops, Lewis is like, well, nice try, but ultimately unconvincing because, like, not everything can be explained. Questions about the causal loop argument before we go on? Yes? Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, you're like, how did she come up with it in the first place is kind of what you're asking. And like, if we really take the causal loop seriously, she comes up with it because her past self gave her the plans. Right? That is the explanation for how she came up with it. And again, like, there's no like deeper explanation than that, according to the causal loop. It's like the structure of the universe is just she comes back in time with the plans, she invents the machine, she makes the plans, she gives the plans to herself. Like, that loop definitely does not have some sort of like external explanation for it, is Lewis's idea. But he's trying to convince you based on this passage that you shouldn't think that like inexplicable loops like that are ruled out as being possible. because he's thinking, if you think about like the big picture metaphysical like causal structure of the universe, you're going to get one of these three possibilities: loops, infinite chains, or initial events. And on any of those three options, you have something that's inexplicable, is what he's thinking. And so it is sort of inexplicable, like how the question, like how she got them in the first place. If you're not satisfied by the answer, like she gave them to herself, then there's no other explanation. But it's not like Lewis is thinking that that's not something that rules out the story as being impossible. Other questions about the causal loop argument? Okay, let's go on. So, which premise are we rejecting? I think you rightly said it's the second premise that of the argument. So Lewis thinks not all causal chains have explanations, is basically what he thinks. Okay, so but the more serious argument that's going to cause Lewis more consternation in the paper is the grandfather paradox. And there's a great statement of this paradox in the amazing movie Back to the Future. We're going to watch this clip and see the...
Jennifer could conceivably encounter her future self. The consequences of that could be disastrous. Doc, what do you mean? I foresee two possibilities. One, coming face to face with herself 30 years older would put her into shock and she'd simply pass out. Or two, the encounter could create a time paradox, the results of which could cause a chain reaction that would unravel the very fabric of the space-time continuum and destroy the entire universe. Granted, that's a worst-case scenario. The destruction might in fact be very localized, limited to merely our own galaxy.
Oh, Jennifer.
Okay, so the universe did not explode when Jennifer saw her future self / past self. So the question is, like, what is Doc's worry, right? Doc is worried that if Jennifer meets herself, it will start a paradox that will, as he puts it, unravel the very fabric of the space-time continuum and destroy the entire universe. So, what is that possibility really? Like, why is Doc worried? So the grandfather story is really like the basis for this major argument against the possibility of time travel. And this is an argument that I think convinces a lot of people that time travel is not really metaphysically possible. So let's tell, like, the version that is in Back to the Future is a little bit complicated, and it's also beset with like difficulties where I think the writers of that movie didn't really tell a coherent story. So let's really focus in on it and tell the Tim story that Lewis gives in the paper. So here's the story. Consider Tim. Tim hates his grandfather because his grandfather had success in the munitions trade and built the family fortune that paid for Tim's time machine. Right. So, back in the past, Tim's grandfather was like selling guns to the Nazis or something and made a lot of money doing that. And as a result, Tim gets enough money to build a time travel machine. Right. So that's the beginning of the story. Tim would like nothing so much as to kill his grandfather. But alas, he's too late because his grandfather's already dead. Right? His grandfather died in 1957, like in Argentina or something, while Tim was still a young boy. But now Tim is thinking, wait a minute, I have invented this time travel machine. I can go back and I can like kill my grandfather. Right? So Tim built the time travel machine and he's traveled back to 1920. And he's like, now I'm in 1920, my grandfather is still alive. So great. I can realize my lifelong dream of killing my grandfather. So what does he do? He goes and buys a rifle. He spends long hours in target practice. He shadows his grandfather to learn the routes of his daily walk or whatever. He rents a room along the walk, and he's lurking there in 1921 with the rifle loaded and hate in his heart as his grandfather is walking closer and closer. Right. So, okay, how can the story go on? Well, we already know that if I continue the story by saying, and then Tim kills and shoots and kills his grandfather, and we're imagining that 1921 is like before Tim was born, or like before Tim's parents were conceived or whatever. So that if he actually did it, it would result in a time paradox. Like if I continued the story that way, we would just have a more complicated version of the logically inconsistent time travel story that I told you at the beginning of class, right? So that story would be logically inconsistent, let's say. But the grandfather argument is not about that version of the story, but about the version of the story that isn't logically inconsistent in the straightforward way. So essentially what the grandfather argument is trying to do is to show that even if at the level of what physically happens, I tell a consistent time travel story, there's still an inconsistency about what could have happened that negates the possibility of time travel itself. And here's how the argument goes. So first premise of the argument, Tim has the means and capability for killing a normal person in good conditions, and the conditions are good, right? So Tim, there's nothing wrong with Tim's ability to kill a normal person. He has a gun, he's on the route, he has grandfather in his sights, nothing interferes with that. And so it seems to follow from that Tim can kill his grandfather, right? The conditions have never been better for anybody killing anybody, right? Say that he's a very good shot, 100%, almost 100% of those shots he makes. And so it seems to follow from that he is able to kill his grandfather. He can kill his grandfather. Okay. But another premise is that Tim was born. And if Tim was born, then his grandfather was not killed in 1921. Why? Because his parents were conceived after 1921, right? So given that Tim was born, it can't be the case that his grandfather was killed in 1921. Therefore, his grandfather was not killed in 1921. Right? But it's impossible for something that happens in the future to change the past. Therefore, Tim can't kill his grandfather. And so what is the conclusion of this argument? Really, it's there are two conclusions. It's 2 and 7. But 2 and 7 contradict each other, right? 2 combined with 7 is a straight contradiction, it seems. One says that Tim can kill his grandfather. The other says that Tim can't kill his grandfather. And so, basically the form of the argument is if we allow for the possibility of time travel, even if we're really careful, like Looper or Time Crimes, to tell a consistent story at the physical level, there's always inevitably going to be an inconsistency at the level of what could have happened, at the level of modal possibility, right? And if that's so, if there's inevitably this contradiction at the modal level, at the level of what could have happened, then any time travel story is going to have some sort of inconsistency built in, not physically, but about what could have happened. And so maybe this is based on some sort of metaphysical principles or something. I mean, a lot of these are abilities are a good candidate for having to do with metaphysical possibility. So if that's right, then this argument would seem to establish that time travel is not metaphysically possible, because if it were, then Tim could both be able to do something and simultaneously, in the same sense, not be able to do it. Right? And this is the big argument against the possibility of time travel. Okay, so we'll just reflect on this a bit. Basically, the idea is the real question is can Tim kill his grandfather or can't he? I don't know. Before we go on, for those of you who are tempted to think that time travel is possible, how many of you think he can kill his grandfather? 1 hand, 2 hands. How many of you think he cannot kill his grandfather? Okay, a few more hands. So, for those of you who think that he can, for those of you who think that he can kill his grandfather, I guess it's based on the argument from 1 to 2. For those of you who think he can't, you have to somehow deny this argument from 1 to 2. So, for those of you who think that he can't kill his grandfather, what do you think prevents him? Any ideas? There's this argument that he doesn't and that he can't change the past or something, but you might think that what I can and can't do should be determined by my physical circumstances, right? In fact, I don't do it or whatever, but it's not as though it's a weird thing to think that the hand of logical consistency for the universe is guiding or forcing Tim not to do it. So I don't know. Like, is it really like if Tim like is trying to pull the trigger but he just can't because like logic prevents him? That's a really weird idea. And so that for that reason, you might think that time like it is really possible that he can kill his grandfather. All right. So yeah. So here's what Lewis says. We have to think about like what actually Lewis thinks is the diagnosis here. So Lewis says, you know, of course, roughly how the story of Tim must go on if it's going to be consistent, right? It must be that somehow, some way, Tim fails to kill his grandfather. We know this just because if he did, if the story included the sentence and then Tim killed his grandfather, it would be a logically inconsistent story. Just like my silly story about Sally and the beer not being in the room and being in the room. Okay. But Lewis thinks that there is no real contradiction here. Right? So Lewis thinks that both conclusions are true, and for the very reasons given. So he wants to accept this argument. Now you might think, like, oh, is Lewis just like accepting a contradiction? Like, isn't that really bad? And the answer is that he's not accepting a contradiction. So he thinks that the claim in 2, Tim can kill his grandfather, and the claim in 7, Tim cannot kill his grandfather, though they seem to be like, you know, one is the negation of the other, and so that's a straight contradiction. That's what it seems like. But Lewis is thinking that can is equivocal. That is, can mean different things in different contexts, and does mean different things in 2 versus 7. So for this, we need a little bit of a primer on like what Lewis thinks about abilities. Right? So he thinks that 2 and 7 are not inconsistent. And so what you would expect, I guess, from Lewis is like a theory about what ability is, right? So like, what is it to be able to do something? And like, essentially, he's thinking that you can do something if you're doing it is what he calls compossible with certain background facts. So like, let's unpack this a little bit in like everyday examples. So like, I can lift this backpack, right? That is like something I'm able to do. I'm not doing it right now, but I could do it. And that is true because like add to the background facts that you know about like the weights of backpacks, the existence of this backpack, I guess it's more like a side bag or whatever. Like there's no inconsistency with adding I pick up this backpack to the stock of background facts. But now like say that like this is not in fact the case, but say that this backpack had like 5 tons of a really heavy metal in it or something that no human could pick up, right? If that were true, then plausibly like one background fact would be this bag has like 5 tons in it. And like I lift the bag is not compossible. It's not consistently true at the same time with the bag has 5 tons in it because no one can lift 5 tons or whatever. And so it seems like what is possible or not, what I'm able to do or not, depends on what kind of background facts there are. Right? And like the next natural question is, what determines the background facts? So like how do we know what background facts to hold fixed when asking whether you're doing something is like possible with those background facts? And so Lewis's answer to this is that context gives you this. So like here's kind of what he's thinking. Like suppose that your car gets stolen. I mean, I don't know if anybody owns a car here because of COE or whatever, but like imagine that you did have a car. Now, like your car is stolen and somebody asks you, can you drive your car? Right? You might not know exactly how to answer this question until you know what exactly they're asking about, right? So in one context, say that somebody is like just trying to gauge your driving abilities, right? In that case, the relevant background facts are going to be facts about like your skill level, the existence of roads, the existence of your car, stuff like that. If those are the relevant background facts, then the answer, it seems, is yes, like you can drive your car. It's compossible with your like level of driving skill and your, I don't know, the existence of roads in Singapore or whatever. But in another context, say that it's like, well, somebody's like, oh, I'm bleeding to death. Can you drive me to the hospital? And asks, like, can you drive your car? Can you drive your car to the hospital for me? In that case, the answer pretty much should definitely be no, right? You should not say, yeah, sure, like the person's going to bleed to death. And there it seems as though like the relevant background facts, it's not just facts about your driving skills and the road and stuff, but also the fact that's relevant is that your car is stolen, right? It's not around. And like you're driving the car to the hospital is not possible with the car being stolen and unlocatable, right? And so this is like one circumstance, right? One exact situation where you have a stolen car, but seemingly two answers to the question about whether you can drive it, depending on the aims and interests of the conversation, and correspondingly the relevance of various background facts. So this is essentially like what Lewis is thinking about with abilities. He's like, the ability claims that we make are highly relative to like what background facts we hold fixed. And this is ultimately his explanation of the grandfather paradox argument and why he thinks it doesn't actually lead to a contradiction. So in context 1, which is the one that gives us the subconclusion 2, we're thinking that the background facts are just facts about like the local situation, right? So here X is equal to Tim kills his grandfather, right? Can he do that? Well, suppose that the background facts are just like, you've got a gun, the gun's in good condition, it's loaded, your grandfather's standing right there, you have good aim, you're aiming at him, all of those kinds of background facts. And relative to those background facts, definitely it's possible that you shoot your grandfather, right? And kill your grandfather, right? There's no contradiction there. Indeed, it's like likely that you would do it. And so in that context, he thinks you have the true conclusion that you can kill your grandfather. However, in subconclusion 7, we're adding more background facts into the relevant consideration, right? So in subconclusion 7, the kinds of considerations that drove us to 7 were like, well, we know that the grandfather does not die, right? So here we have like a broader and more expansive conception of the background facts. So here the background facts are like, you have a gun, the gun is in good condition, loaded, grandfather standing next to you, but also Tim's grandfather begat Tim's father who begat Tim, right? And if we add that to the background facts, is it consistent to add the proposition Tim kills his grandfather? Well, no, it's not consistent with this last part of the context, right? Like Tim kills his grandfather is not like, well, implicitly, like Tim kills his grandfather before his father is conceived, is not possible consistent with this sentence, that Tim's grandfather begat Tim's father who begat Tim. And so relative to those different background facts, he thinks that 2 and 7, though seemingly contradictory, are not actually contradictory. They mean different things in the context in which they're asserted. And so 2 and 7 are like both true. And so, yeah, relative to context 1, it's true to say that Tim can kill his grandfather. But relative to 2, it's false to say that Tim can kill his grandfather, and true to say that he cannot kill his grandfather. And so, relative to either context, you have a consistent set of propositions, right? Like, in one you can, in the other you cannot, and the other sentence is like false in each of those contexts. So, basically, this is how Lewis diffuses the grandfather paradox. He says abilities are relative to contexts, so there's no real contradiction here. And so in this consistent time travel story, where of course Tim does not in fact kill his grandfather, there's no contradiction that you can prove about what he is and isn't able to do. And so, once again, Lewis thinks that this argument against time travel, as he's understanding it, fails. Questions about Lewis's response? Like, is this satisfying? Does this convince you that time travel is, like, possible? Or at least that this argument is no good? Like, does anybody have the intuition that, like, well, like, obviously he doesn't kill his grandfather, but like even like so answer this question, like even if he tried, could he kill his grandfather? And it seems as though like there's no real possibility where he tries and succeeds, right? Like any possibility in which he tries and succeeds is one that generates a paradox, which of course leads to a logically inconsistent story. So like I don't know, one thing I think you could reasonably object to is like yeah, of course, like sometimes we speak shorthand about possibility in this kind of like loose way. But if you're really being serious about it, Lewis, like the kind of possibility that generates this is like a kind of fake possibility. Because no matter how hard he tried, like this is definitely true, no matter how hard Tim tries, he does not succeed in killing his grandfather. And you might think that like if something is the case that if it's the case that like no matter how hard you tried at something you would not succeed, then you can't really do it. Like if I told you no matter how hard you try at getting an A in this course, you're not going to get an A, right? How many like do you think some of you could object to the dean like it's not possible to get an A in this class? Like I'm not able to get an A. And I could like if I'm Lewis, I could object and be like, well, no, you're still able to do it. It's just that if you tried, you'd fail. I don't know. Like it seems a little bit weird, I think. I don't know. Anybody have any further thoughts about this? Like, do you think it's really possible that Tim could kill his grandfather? I mean, yeah, or put another way, do you think I would be lying to you if I said it's really possible for you to get an A in a situation where no matter how hard you try, you do not get an A? How many of you think, yes, it still can be possible? How many of you think, no, it's not possible to get an A? Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, if you're following that line, then you might not be totally satisfied with Lewis's diagnosis, right? Because, like, if you really kind of think, no, but is it really, really possible? You might think, yeah, like, if no matter how hard you try, you don't do it, then it's not, like, it might be, like, yeah, possible in some loose-hand way or something. But it's not, like, super, super really possible in a metaphysically interesting sense. Yeah, in which case that wouldn't, like, it would sort of be an argument against this kind of like, oh, well, possibility means different things in different contexts, and so it's like there's only facts about what has come possible with what, etc. Okay, so this is Lewis's grand argument that time travel is possible. He doesn't really argue that time travel is possible. He just says these two arguments against its being possible do not succeed. So the causal loops argument does not succeed because some causal loops are like going to be accepted in any kind of theory, and the grandfather paradox does not succeed in his argument against time travel because ability is just relative to background facts, and so we can't actually generate a contradiction, is ultimately his view. So, like, a few caveats about this. And I have some practice questions as promised, but so a few caveats about this is that one common feature of time travel movies is that often they're like branching time kinds of movies, right? So, like, for example, in Back to the Future, like, sometimes you go back in the past and then you create a new, essentially, like, timeline that's like different than the old timeline. That's like that is a possible structure for space-time, right? A kind of branching structure. That's not really like Lewis isn't really talking about that. He's just talking about a single timeline time travel, right? So, like, the Sally case is time travel within one timeline, right? That's like there's just one timeline, and it involves this Sally loop. It's not a case where like anything changes. And a lot of interesting time travel movies happen when things change, and like trigger a different branch. And one thing you could think about is like what happens to all of these paradoxes if you have branching time. So, like, say that every time you go back and change the past, what really happens is that you just like trigger a new branch. What would the grandfather's paradox look like there? Like, so think about the branches as literally like think of it really like a graph, right? So, like, you start out along the. I really wish I had things to draw, but like you start out along. No, that's impossible as well. You start out along one timeline, right? And then you go back in time, and then say that you change something that didn't happen in the original version, right? So you kill your grandfather, say. there's some weird stories where like you disappear or vanish or something, or the universe explodes. But like one maybe possible way things could be is that like you're already there. The thing that grounds the fact that you existed is that you came into existence along the original timeline, according to which you didn't kill your grandfather. But now that you killed your grandfather, you start a new timeline into existence, and you carry along on that new timeline, right? So like from the big picture, like external four-dimensional perspective, there's not really a paradox, because you were begat by somebody on a timeline, and then you just traveled and then went along a different timeline, right? And so that's not really a paradox either, depending on the details of how the branching work, I guess. So, yeah, I mean, this is something that a lot of time travel movies get like tripped up on, is exactly the details of the branching. In Back to the Future, it's like really, really weird because you get like probabilities in the branching, and like things start like disappearing slowly when they become less probable that they'll exist. I don't really know a consistent metaphysics that makes sense of that. If any of you want to write a paper about that and send it to me, I'd be very interested to read it. Okay, so that's basically all of the material I have today. I have some practice questions here that you can read on your own time about like possibility and what Lewis thinks about the time travel paradox. Also, there are some follow-up courses that you could take if you're interested in this time travel stuff. So metaphysics, like this is basically like, this was a crash course on metaphysics today, basically. And so we teach a metaphysics class at a 2000 level. That is a very interesting class. Also, like science fiction and philosophy is a very interesting class that deals with some of these like time travel issues. Okay, and that's all for today. So remember to like, I don't know, put the final exam in your calendar, and then we'll have one more meeting next week, and I believe that is our last meeting for this class. So we'll read the parfit. All right, see you next week.